In 2026, this story is no longer loud. That's what makes it harder to face. The Whittakers were never built for attention. Their lives ran on repetition, not disruption. Morning routines that didn't change. Chairs placed the same way. Voices that filled space simply because silence felt wrong. For decades, that rhythm, fragile, imperfect, but familiar, was the closest thing they had to stability. Then the rhythm broke. When the state intervened and 3 members were removed, the house didn't erupt. There was no dramatic collapse caught on camera. What followed instead was something quieter and more dangerous: subtraction. Fewer people. Fewer routines. Fewer hands to notice when something went wrong. The house in Odd didn't just lose occupants. It lost function. Every household runs on invisible labor. Someone remembers when to eat. Someone checks the stove. Someone notices when winter cuts deeper than expected. When those people disappear, the house doesn't announce the danger, it absorbs it. In 2026, the Whittaker home exists in that absorbed silence. What remains is not chaos in the cinematic sense. It's absence. Chairs that don't move. Rooms that don't change. Days that stretch longer because there's no one left to divide them into pieces. And this is where the story actually begins, not with removal, but with what removal leaves behind. Because once the state steps in, the family's future is no longer decided only by blood or habit. It's shaped by systems that speak a different language. Case files. Evaluations. Risk assessments. Confidentiality rules. Legal thresholds. Words like capacity and safety replace words like home and together. Those systems don't explain themselves to the people living inside them. They don't sit at the kitchen table and walk families through what comes next. They don't tell you how long the silence will last, or whether it means protection or preparation. So the house becomes a waiting room. Waiting for information that doesn't come. Waiting for winter to pass. Waiting for someone to knock again, not knowing if that knock means help or another ending. In 2026, the Whittaker home is still standing, but it's standing under observation. That matters more than people realize. When a home has already been flagged as unsafe, it doesn't return to neutrality just because part of the family is gone. It enters a different phase. Monitored. Assessed. Compared against standards it was never designed to meet. Sanitation. Food storage. Medication access. Fall risk. Emergency response. These aren't abstract concepts. They are thresholds. And thresholds don't care about history. For the people still inside the house, daily life becomes a balancing act. Not just of survival, but of appearance. Doing enough to avoid triggering concern. Saying enough, but not too much. Letting outsiders know you're managing, even when managing costs more energy than you have left. In some accounts, this tension is palpable. The sense that every decision carries weight. That the house itself has learned caution. That routine is no longer comfort, it's camouflage. We don't talk to nobody, one version of the story claims. Not out of secrecy, but fear. Fear that one wrong interaction could bring scrutiny back to the door. That fear isn't irrational. When systems return, they don't return casually. They return because something tipped the scale. And once a scale tips once, it rarely balances again on its own. This is why 2026 is so different from the years before. Before, the Whittakers lived outside the system. Neglected, yes. Vulnerable, yes. But largely invisible. Now they are known. And being known means being measured. The most dangerous myth about intervention is that it's a single event. That removal is the end of the story. That aftercare happens somewhere else and the original home becomes irrelevant. That isn't how it works. Once attention arrives, state attention, it doesn't fully leave. It shifts. It watches from a distance. It waits for the next data point to fall. A hospitalization, a neighbor's call, a utility shutoff, a winter emergency. None of these have to be dramatic. They only have to be documented. And documentation is what turns a fragile situation into a legal one. In 2026, the Whittaker home sits inside that reality. There are conflicting reports about who remains there and in what condition. Some accounts describe continuity, two people holding the line, maintaining what they can, refusing to let the house slide any further. Others suggest a deeper fracture, one pillar already gone, the others struggling alone. Those contradictions matter, because this family has already been harmed by misinformation. They've been used before as symbols, as leverage, as tools for attention and money. False narratives have traveled faster than facts, leaving damage behind even after they were disproven. That history changes how we move forward. In 2026, truth has to slow down. We cannot afford to treat rumors as updates. We cannot afford to let grief or fear fill in gaps that only verification should occupy. Every unconfirmed claim adds pressure to people who are already living under it. The house doesn't need speculation. It needs stability. And stability, at this stage, isn't just about money or repairs. It's about predictability. Knowing what rules apply. Knowing who is watching. Knowing what would trigger another intervention and what might prevent one. That knowledge is rarely given freely, which leaves the people inside the house navigating a system they didn't choose, with tools they were never given. This is why the question of 2026 isn't, what happened? It's, what happens next if nothing changes? Because aging doesn't pause for legal process. Health doesn't wait for clarity. Homes don't stabilize themselves through willpower alone. The house in Odd has always been fragile. What's different now is that fragility has a file. And files don't forget. As this story moves forward, we are not chasing shock or revelation. We are following consequence. The slow kind. The kind that unfolds without witnesses. This first part is about setting the ground truth. The house is quieter, the system is closer, and the margin for error is smaller than it has ever been. Everything that comes next depends on whether anyone steps in before the next threshold is crossed. That is where this story truly stands in 2026. In 2026, the greatest threat facing the Whittakers is no longer the conditions inside the house alone. It's what surrounds the house now: misinformation, speculation, and the endless echo of half-truths that move faster than reality ever can. Silence doesn't stay empty for long. When official channels go quiet, people fill the gap. Some do it out of concern. Others do it out of boredom. A few do it because chaos creates opportunity. And the Whittakers have learned, painfully, that attention doesn't always arrive with help attached. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that there are now multiple versions of the same reality circulating at once. In one version, life inside the house continues in a fragile but recognizable way. Familiar routines are held together through sheer determination. Days are slow. Nights are colder. But the house is still occupied, still functioning, still resisting collapse through effort that outsiders rarely see. In this version, the people who remain understand that visibility equals risk. They keep to themselves not because they don't want help, but because they're afraid of what help might trigger. In another version, the story tilts darker. One voice disappears. The house becomes quieter than expected. Concern escalates into certainty without evidence. And suddenly, conclusions harden into facts before anyone checks if they're true. That contradiction isn't harmless. It's destabilizing. Because this family has already been targeted by false narratives before, and those narratives caused real damage. There was a time when a rumor about a death spread faster than any official correction. Sympathy was weaponized. Money was solicited. Grief was manufactured. And when the truth surfaced, the damage didn't magically undo itself. Trust eroded. Confusion lingered. And the family was left carrying consequences they never agreed to. That history matters now more than ever. In 2026, every unverified claim carries weight. Not just online, but in the real world. Because systems pay attention to noise. Authorities don't live in a vacuum. Reports pile up. Calls get logged. Patterns form, even if the pattern is built on misunderstanding. Misinformation doesn't just distort public perception. It can change outcomes. This is why restraint is no longer optional. The Whittaker situation sits at the intersection of vulnerability and visibility. And that intersection is dangerous. Every rumor risks becoming a welfare concern. Every exaggeration risks triggering another assessment. Every outsider convinced they're helping risks becoming the reason the system steps back in. And once that happens, there's no rewind. In 2026, the people still tied to the house don't get to explain themselves publicly. Confidentiality laws don't work both ways. They protect those already in care, but they also seal off communication. What's happening behind the scenes stays behind the scenes, even when silence breeds anxiety. So the internet talks louder. Some claim inside knowledge. Some claim insider sources. Others recycle old images, old assumptions, old fears, dressing them up as updates. The same phrases repeat. I heard. Someone said. It looks like. None of those are facts. And facts are the only thing that matters now. Because the Whittakers are no longer just living their lives. They are living under evaluation. That changes everything. When a home has already been flagged once, the margin for tolerance shrinks. The benefit of the doubt evaporates. Even neutral conditions can be reinterpreted as warning signs. This is why accuracy becomes protection. If the house is occupied, it matters who is there. If someone is absent, it matters why. If support is being provided, it matters by whom and how consistently. If there is decline, it matters whether it's being addressed. Guessing helps no one. And yet, the pressure to guess is constant. People want closure. They want clean narratives. They want to know if the story ends in rescue or collapse. But real lives don't resolve on schedule. Especially not when age, poverty, and bureaucracy intersect. In 2026, the Whittaker story exists in fragments. Verified information moves slowly. Rumors sprint ahead. And the family is left navigating consequences created by people who will never meet them. This is where responsibility shifts to the audience. Watching is easy. Speculating is easier. But neither is harmless anymore. If you care about the people inside this story, the most important thing you can do is resist the urge to fill in blanks. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means privacy laws are working the way they're designed to. That can feel unbearable. But it's also the reason some of the most vulnerable members of this family are no longer being used as content. Privacy is not abandonment. It's protection. The problem is that protection for some can feel like erasure for others. And that tension fuels fear. The house, meanwhile, doesn't have the luxury of abstraction. It exists in weather, in physical decay, in the slow wear of time. It doesn't care what version of the story people believe. It only responds to what actually happens inside it. Heat either works or it doesn't. Food is either there or it isn't. Health either holds or it declines. And those realities don't trend online. In this environment, misinformation becomes more than a nuisance. It becomes a hazard. A false report can spark a visit. A distorted image can provoke a call. A viral claim can force action before facts are checked. And once action happens, there's no undoing the stress it creates. That's why 2026 demands a different approach. No more amplifying claims without sources. No more screenshots without dates. No more recycled footage framed as current reality. No more turning uncertainty into content. This isn't about defending anyone. It's about not making things worse. The Whittakers have lived most of their lives unseen. When they were finally seen, it came with consequences they didn't consent to and couldn't control. Now, the only ethical path forward is to reduce harm, not increase it. That means letting verified information lead. That means allowing quiet when quiet is what safety requires. That means understanding that not knowing everything is sometimes the cost of doing the least damage. In 2026, truth is not loud. It doesn't arrive with dramatic reveals. It shows up in records, in patterns, in slow confirmations. And until those confirmations exist, the most powerful thing anyone can do is stop adding noise. Because the Whittakers don't need another wave of attention. They need time, stability, and space to survive whatever comes next without being pulled apart by speculation. This part of the story isn't about what we think is happening. It's about what we refuse to invent. And that refusal may be the only real protection left. By 2026, the Whittaker story is no longer driven by emotion alone. It is driven by systems. And systems don't act on outrage or sympathy. They act on documentation, thresholds, and risk. This is the part most people never see coming. When Adult Protective Services steps in once, it doesn't simply disappear afterward. It watches. Quietly. Methodically. Over time. And that changes the stakes for everyone left behind. For the Whittakers, this means life is no longer lived freely inside the margins of isolation. Every ordinary struggle now exists under the shadow of evaluation. Not because someone is being hunted, but because once vulnerability is documented, it doesn't get erased. It gets monitored. This is where the idea of a legal clock becomes real. The clock doesn't tick loudly. There's no countdown posted on the door. Instead, it advances through patterns, missed medical appointments, repeated emergencies, unsafe living conditions, signs of self-neglect, lack of consistent support. None of these trigger action alone. Together, over time, they build a case. And in 2026, that case is no longer theoretical. The people still tied to the house are aging. Their health is fragile. Their support network is thinner than it has ever been. And the house itself, long described as deteriorating, has not magically healed just because fewer people live inside it now. This matters because the system is designed around one central question. Can the adults involved reliably keep themselves safe? Not comfortable. Not happy. That bar is lower than many people realize, and higher than the Whittaker situation may be able to sustain indefinitely. Here is the hard truth. Independence is not the same as safety. And the law prioritizes safety. If a person can legally make their own decisions but those decisions repeatedly result in harm or risk, the system has a mechanism to intervene. That mechanism is guardianship. Guardianship is not punishment. It is not automatically removal. It is the state's last resort tool when autonomy and safety can no longer coexist. And once guardianship becomes a serious consideration, everything changes. Medical evaluations follow. Social workers document conditions. Courts get involved. A guardian ad litem may be appointed to represent the individual's interests, not the family's, not the internet's, but the person's legal welfare. From the outside, this can look sudden. From the inside, it is the result of a long, quiet buildup. This is why 2026 feels so tense. Because the Whittakers are no longer just living in a difficult situation. They are living on the edge of a decision that may not belong to them anymore. The system always prefers the least restrictive option. That means keeping people in their home if possible. supporting them where they are, adding services instead of removing autonomy. But that preference only holds if the environment can be made safe. If the house remains hazardous, if heating is unreliable, if food access is inconsistent, if medical care is reactive instead of proactive, then least restrictive becomes a smaller circle. And sometimes that circle no longer includes the home. This is where compassion becomes complicated. Many people believe that staying in one's home is always the most humane outcome. And emotionally, that makes sense. Familiar spaces feel safer than institutions. Memories live in walls. Identity is tied to place. But safety does not respect nostalgia. If someone falls and no one can help them up, the house becomes a liability. If someone becomes ill and there is no immediate care, the house becomes dangerous. If winter hits and heating fails, the house becomes life-threatening. These are not hypothetical risks. They are documented realities in cases like this. And once another emergency happens, another hospitalization, another injury, another crisis, the system will not start from zero. It will build on what it already knows. This is why restraint matters so much now. Because every external disruption increases stress. And stress accelerates decline. Unannounced visitors. Online pressure. False welfare reports. Even well-meaning attention can tip the balance. What outsiders see as checking in can be logged as instability. In 2026, the Whittakers don't have the luxury of being misunderstood. Their margin for error is gone. This is the part of the story no one wants to acknowledge, that sometimes love is not enough to keep a system at bay. That sometimes family bonds cannot substitute for medical infrastructure. And that sometimes the safest outcome is also the most painful. The people who were already removed are now living under structured care. That structure has rules, schedules, oversight. It removes chaos, but it also removes freedom. For those still tied to the house, the future sits in limbo between two outcomes: remain at home with increasing oversight, or be placed elsewhere if safety cannot be guaranteed. Neither option is simple. Neither option is free of loss. And the system does not care about public opinion when it decides. It cares about documentation. This is why speculation is dangerous. Every rumor risks becoming a report. Every viral claim risks becoming a red flag. Every outsider insisting they know the truth risks accelerating the very outcome they claim to fear. The most ethical thing anyone can do right now is allow the process to move without interference. That doesn't mean ignoring the Whittakers. It means refusing to make them a battleground. Because once guardianship proceedings begin, there is no crowd appeal. There is no comment section. There is only a courtroom, paperwork, and decisions that last. And if that moment comes, the Whittakers will not be allowed to explain themselves publicly. Their voices will be filtered through legal representatives. Their lives will be reduced to assessments and risk scores. This is why 2026 feels like a threshold year. Not because something dramatic has already happened, but because something irreversible could happen next. The house stands quietly now. Fewer people. Fewer routines. Less noise. And with that quiet comes scrutiny. What happens next depends on factors most people will never see: medical reports, safety evaluations, support availability, and whether the house can be stabilized before another crisis forces the system's hand. This is not a story that ends cleanly. It is a story that demands patience, restraint, and a willingness to accept that the most humane outcome may not look the way we want it to. In 2026, the real question is no longer who is at fault. The question is whether anyone can help without making things worse. If you've read this far, ask yourself this before commenting: does what I'm about to say reduce harm or add to it? Because right now, the future of this story is being written quietly far from the internet. And the next chapter will not ask for permission. Comment below with thoughtful, responsible discussion only. What do you think the safest path forward really looks like in a situation like this? By the time people ask, where are they now? The story has already shifted into a phase most outsiders never fully understand. Because in cases like this, answers don't come in the form of addresses, photos, or updates you can point to on a map. They come in absences, in restrictions, in rules that feel cruel until you understand why they exist. The question about those who were removed, where they are, how they're doing, whether they're happy, keeps resurfacing because silence feels unnatural to people raised on constant access. But in 2026, that silence is not accidental. It is deliberate. State care operates on confidentiality for one reason above all others: protection. Once individuals are identified as vulnerable adults, their personal details are no longer public property. Not to the internet. Not to donors. Not even, in many cases, to extended family in the way people expect. This is where many narratives break down. People assume removal means punishment, or secrecy means something sinister, or lack of updates means neglect. But the reality is more complicated and far less dramatic. State care is not one place. It is a process. It can begin with evaluation, medical, psychological, functional. It can involve temporary placement, supervised living, assisted care, or medical facilities depending on what assessments reveal. It can change as needs change. And almost none of it is designed to be visible to outsiders. That invisibility is intentional, because for years, visibility was the problem. Being seen did not protect the Whittakers. It exposed them. It invited strangers into their lives. It turned private hardship into public spectacle. It blurred the line between concern and entitlement. So when people ask why there are no updates, the answer may be this: because updates were the harm. For the first time, the people who were removed are living without cameras, without commentary, without being reduced to symbols. They are no longer required to perform their suffering for anyone's understanding. And that matters more than curiosity. What can be said, carefully, is this: removal only happens when the state determines that remaining in place presents unacceptable risk. That decision is not made lightly. It is built on reports, observations, and assessments that point to sustained danger or inability to meet basic needs. Once removed, individuals are not abandoned. They are placed under supervision where basic stability becomes non-negotiable. Meals arrive on time. Medication is monitored. Hygiene is handled. Temperature is regulated. Medical issues are addressed proactively instead of reactively. Is it perfect? Is it emotionally painful? Almost always. But it replaces uncertainty with structure. And structure, while restrictive, can be life-saving. This is where many people struggle morally. Because separation feels wrong. Because family bonds feel sacred. Because the idea of siblings being apart feels unbearable. But separation does not always mean rejection. Sometimes it means survival. The deeper, harder question in 2026 is not where those individuals are. It is what happens to the ones still connected to the house as the contrast becomes unavoidable. Because when part of a family enters structured care and another part remains in instability, the gap widens quickly. One side becomes regulated, predictable, monitored. The other remains exposed to the same risks that triggered intervention in the first place, only now with fewer hands, fewer voices, fewer supports. This creates an emotional fracture that the system does not fix. Those left behind experience grief that has no ceremony, no closure, no timeline. They live with unanswered questions because confidentiality laws do not bend for comfort. They may not know where their loved ones sleep, what they eat, how they are feeling, and that not knowing becomes its own form of suffering. But the system is not built to heal emotional wounds. It is built to reduce risk. This is why people must stop framing this story as a mystery to be solved. There is no hidden location waiting to be revealed. No secret update being withheld for drama. No conspiracy behind the silence. There is only a legal boundary drawn around vulnerable adults who no longer belong to the public narrative. And crossing that boundary, even verbally, can have consequences. Speculation about conditions, treatment, or well-being doesn't just spread misinformation. It can trigger reviews. It can prompt additional restrictions. It can reinforce the belief that outside pressure is a risk factor. In other words, the more people demand access, the less access anyone gets. This is why restraint is not indifference. It is respect. The hardest truth is that state care may currently be the safest environment some members of the family have ever known. And that safety exists precisely because the internet is no longer invited inside. That doesn't erase the trauma of removal. It doesn't erase longing. It doesn't erase loss. But it reframes the purpose of silence. Silence, in this case, is a shield. And now we arrive at the most uncomfortable part of this chapter. If structured care is working for those who were removed, what does that mean for the future of those who remain? Because the system does not ignore contrast. If outcomes improve under supervision, health stabilizes, emergencies decrease, conditions improve, that becomes part of the record. And records inform decisions. The question no one wants to ask out loud is this: if separation led to measurable improvement for some, will the system eventually conclude it must intervene further? That is not a judgment. It is how systems reason. This is why every day matters now. Every stable moment at the house matters. Every avoided emergency matters. Every improvement matters. And every unnecessary disruption threatens to undo that fragile balance. This is not the time for saviors, or exposés, or crusades. It is the time for quiet, responsible observation, and letting professionals do what crowds cannot. Because the story is no longer about who gets to tell it. It's about who gets to live through it safely. In 2026, the most ethical stance is not demanding answers. It is accepting that some answers are not ours to have. And understanding that sometimes, care looks like distance, not because people don't matter, but because they finally do. Comment below with care and responsibility only. How do we balance the need for accountability with the right to privacy when vulnerable lives are involved? By 2026, the Whittaker story reaches a point where the question is no longer who failed them in the past, but who is willing to act responsibly in the present. This is where narratives usually collapse. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because what remains requires restraint instead of outrage, patience instead of urgency, and care instead of control. What remains is aging. Aging changes everything. For Betty and Larry, aging is no longer something happening quietly in the background. It is the central force shaping every outcome ahead. Their world has narrowed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, through fatigue, grief, and the absence of people who once filled the space around them. Aging doesn't announce itself with sirens. It shows up in smaller ways. Slower mornings, missed meals, forgetting whether medication was taken, confusion about dates, exhaustion that doesn't lift after sleep. These are not moral failures. They are biological realities. And when aging intersects with isolation, poverty, and a deteriorating environment, the margin for error disappears. This is where many people misunderstand what help actually means. Help is not a crowd showing up. Help is not a donation link without oversight. Help is not exposure. Help is stability, structure, and continuity, things that cannot be crowdsourced. The hardest truth of 2026 is this: the Whittakers don't need attention. They need systems. And systems move slowly. That slowness frustrates people who want visible outcomes. People who want reassurance. People who want resolution. But slow systems are often the only ones that prevent irreversible harm. This is why the future of Betty and Larry cannot hinge on viral interest. It cannot depend on whether people are still paying attention next month. It cannot be sustained by emotional reactions alone. What matters now is whether there is a realistic plan for aging in place, or whether the system will eventually decide that aging in place is no longer safe. This decision is rarely made in a courtroom first. It is made quietly through documentation, missed medical appointments, repeated emergencies, unsafe living conditions that don't improve, signs of cognitive decline. Each one becomes a data point, and data points add up. This is why the question, who will help the Whittakers, cannot be answered with names alone. It must be answered with infrastructure. Is there consistent medical care? Is there reliable access to food and heat? Is the home environment being maintained to a basic standard of safety? Is there someone accountable, not emotionally invested, not financially motivated, not seeking recognition, but legally responsible? If the answer to these questions remains uncertain, the system does not wait forever. Eventually, the legal clock resumes. And when it does, decisions become less flexible. This is the part of the story people often don't want to hear. Sometimes the state intervenes not because it wants to, but because there is no one else left who can. That doesn't make the outcome painless, but it makes it predictable. The tragedy would not be intervention itself. The tragedy would be intervention delayed until after a preventable crisis. This is why restraint from the public matters so much right now. Every rumor, every false claim, every unauthorized visit increases scrutiny, increases pressure, increases the likelihood that authorities feel compelled to step in sooner rather than later. People often believe they are helping when they amplify concern. But concern without accuracy becomes risk. Concern without boundaries becomes intrusion. Concern without patience becomes harm. The most responsible role outsiders can play in 2026 is not participation, it is protection. Protection of privacy. Protection of dignity. Protection of truth. This means refusing to spread unverified claims about deaths, removals, or conditions. It means questioning fundraising efforts that lack transparency. It means understanding that silence does not mean neglect. It often means legal compliance. And it means accepting that some stories do not belong to the audience anymore. The Whittakers did not choose to become a case study in internet ethics. But that is what this has become. Their story now tests whether people can care without consuming, whether they can observe without intruding, whether they can advocate without exploiting. The future is still unwritten. Betty and Larry are still alive. Their days still matter. Their comfort still matters. Their safety still matters. And what happens next will depend less on outrage and more on whether the right supports quietly take root before another emergency forces the system's hand. This is not a call for action in the traditional sense. It is a call for discipline, for patience, for humility. Because the final chapter of the Whittaker story should not be written by strangers trying to feel useful. It should be shaped by careful, professional, accountable care that centers the people themselves, not the narrative around them. If there is one lesson 2026 demands we learn, it is this. Attention is not care. Silence is not abandonment. And dignity is not negotiable. The future will not be loud. But if done right, it can be safer than the past. Comment below thoughtfully. What responsibility does the public have when a private family's suffering becomes a shared story, and when is stepping back the most ethical choice? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.